Ancient Rome wasn't merely a realm of legions and marble arches, it was an empire, where sexuality was wielded as the sharpest instrument of authority behind closed palace doors. Emperors staged orgies of power so perverse they make even modern dictators recoil. These weren't private vices, but political theater, broadcasts of imperial dominance that shaped Roman law, religion, and society for centuries, drawing on Tacitus, Suetonius, and contemporary documents. This journey will unveil how emperors from Caligula to Elagabalus used rape, incest, gender transgression, and state-sponsored brothels to declare, "Mawa knows no bounds," prepared to enter the hidden chambers where the emperor's bed became the truest seat of power. In Roman eyes, sex was never about love or pleasure, but about dominance. The penetrator wielded absolute power. The penetrated was rendered a slave. Emperors harnessed this brutal hierarchy to broadcast their will, transforming private pleasure into public theater. Caligula famously forced senators' wives into his palace brothel, demonstrating that not even Rome's most powerful could protect their families from imperial caprice. Tacitus and Suetonius recorded each outrage not as mere scandal, but as proof of an emperor's character. Unchecked indulgence in the bedroom foretold merciless rule in the Senate and on the battlefield. The imperial bedchamber became the truest seat of power, where sexual access or immunity determined political fate, and where the emperor's body itself was both weapon and throne. In Rome, the bedroom was no refuge from politics, it was the epicenter of imperial power. From the moment an emperor ascended the throne, his sexual will became law. Rape, forced prostitution, and public spectacles of degradation were wielded like swords to cleave opposition and instill fear. Under Caligula, senators learned they could not even shield their own wives from his whims when they were pressed into the palace brothel as living proof of his omnipotence. Tacitus and Suetonius understood that an emperor's private conduct was a mirror of his public rule. One who penetrated without restraint would govern without mercy. Emperors extended this paradigm beyond Rome's walls. Soldiers were encouraged to ravage conquered lands so that entire provinces would bend the knee in terror rather than revolt. Thus, sexual dominance became the most visceral statement of sovereignty, merging flesh and statecraft into an unbreakable bond. To control Rome's people, the emperor first had to control their bodies. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, arrived in 37 AD amid great fanfare, hailed as Rome's shining young dawn. Yet within months, he turned that promise into a carnival of cruelty. Caligula flouted Roman taboos by openly bedding his three sisters at public banquets, seating them where the empress would sit, thus proclaiming that no family bond could challenge his imperial will. When his sister Drusilla died in 38 AD, he deified her and decreed mourning rituals so extreme, he made it a capital crime to laugh or dine with one's own family, that the empire shuddered beneath his grief. Then came his grotesque feature, the Palace of Pleasures, a private brothel staffed by senators' wives and daughters, where he forced their husbands to watch through hidden windows, charging admission to these spectacles and turning sexual humiliation into state revenue. His legendary claim that his horse and Citatus deserved a consulship was more than eccentricity. It was a phallic punchline aimed at the Senate, reminding Rome that their offices and their wives were at his command. In Caligula's world, every orgasm was an affirmation of imperial supremacy, every scandal a strategic blow against dignity itself. After Caligula's violent excesses, one might have hoped Rome's sexual tyranny would abate. Instead, Tiberius Claudius Nero, emperor from AD 14 to 37, transformed the idyllic island of Capri into his personal sanctuary of shadows, where his twisted appetite secured his rule and terrorized Rome's elite. Exile or escape. In AD 26, wearied by political strife in the capital, Tiberius retreated to Capri, ostensibly to rest. Yet his withdrawal was hardly retirement. It was the opening act of a reign conducted through coercion and blackmail. Accessible only by perilous sea and guarded by mountain sentinels, Capri became the perfect fortress for his most perverse fantasies. The pools of power Tiberius's villa later excavated at Villa Jovis featured a labyrinth of bathing chambers and marine pools. Suetonius writes that in these secluded waters, the emperor summoned young men and women, known mockingly as little fishes, to enact his every whim. Stripped of rank and dignity, these captives performed intimate acts in the emperor's presence or were flung, naked and splayed, into the sea as an amusement for visiting dignitaries. Archaeological digs at Via Jovis confirm Suetonius's account. Marble pools carved into bedrock, private alcoves hidden behind colonnades, and fresco fragments hinting at erotic murals. Every corner of the villa could witness scenes of sexual degradation, bound to the emperor's desire and sealed by the silence of the island's inaccessibility. Rooms of ritualized humiliation beyond the baths lay a series of private chambers, each adorned with explicit reliefs, youths entwined with serpents, couples in contorted embraces, and phallic symbols interwoven with imperial eagles. These rooms served as stages where Tiberius reordered social hierarchies. High-born youths were forced into submission, their aristocratic heritage reduced to fodder for the emperor's cruelty. The trauma inflicted there was not random sadism, but calculated leverage. Victims and their families knew that any hint of rebellion would echo in Capri's dark rooms. Political leverage through lust. Tiberius's victims often came from Rome's most powerful families. By humiliating senators' sons or provincial governors, he forged an invisible chain of blackmail that secured loyalty without troops or taxes. A single whispered rumor of an illicit rendezvous could unseat a rival. An acquiescence to imperial lust ensured a career and sometimes a life. The island's fatal secrecy. Tiberius's choice of Capri was strategic. The island's narrow passes and rocky coasts discouraged desertion, while the absence of a resonant aristocracy meant fewer witnesses. Couriers carried messages under cover of night. Senators begged for audience via intermediaries, fearful that exposure would lead to public disgrace or worse. Capri was both palace and prisoner realm of perpetual shadows, where Tiberius reigned as both god and jailer. Legacy of Ferwin Cassius Severus, a bold senator, dared to speak of Capri's horrors in the Senate. Tiberius responded not with open violence, but with silence, and ominous mark that even the suggestion of imperial wrongdoing was treason. Many who survived his whims returned to Rome broken men, their families cowed into silence before green-eyed envy could destroy them. The emperor's death and aftermath in AD 37. Tiberius died reportedly of natural causes, though some whispered of smothering at the hands of his own guard. Rome greeted the news with cautious relief. Caligula's chaos had followed his name, but Capri's sinister legacy persisted. Tales of the emperor's depravity fueled scandalous memoirs and moralizing histories. Suetonius and Tacitus, writing decades later, treated Tiberius's island as the epicenter of imperial evil, proof that an emperor's sexual life was not private vice, but a reflection of his political soul, enduring Echo Capri's ruins still. Whisper of Tiberius's dark reign. Modern visitors to Villa Jovis traverse halls once drenched in fear, pondering how absolute power wedded to absolute secrecy can warp the human spirit. In Tiberius's island court, sex became a weapon, intimacy a cage, and the emperor's body the ultimate throne of terror. In AD 218, the teenage priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal emerged from the desert to claim Rome's purple, and hardly had he draped himself in imperial robes before he launched a sexually revolutionary, if not outright revolutionary, assault on Roman norms. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known by his godly title Elagabalus, ruled for turbulent years, yet his reign remains the mythic symbol of imperial decadence, gender defiance, and the weaponization of eroticism. From desert shrine to imperial court, Elagabalus's ascent was engineered by his powerful grandmother, Julia Misa, who leveraged his role as high priest of Elagabal, whose cult centered on a massive black stone phallus, to oust the reigning emperor. But once in power, Elagabalus shed his grandmother's cautious tutelage and unleashed his personal vision of godhood, a divinity who transcended all human boundaries, including gender and sexual propriety. Gender as performance and power wear. Rome prized masculine virtue, Elagabalus embraced fluidity. Contemporary chroniclers record that he wore women's attire in public, adorning himself with makeup, fine silks, and jewelry normally reserved for matrone, demanded to be called by feminine names, insisting that his subjects recognize a new divine identity, sought doctors across the empire to fashion him female genitalia, offering sums vast enough to fund legions for what we would now call gender affirmation surgery, though none dared attempt the procedure. This defiance of Roman gender order was not mere personal whim, but a political statement. If the emperor could rewrite nature, no senator or soldier could claim unassailable stability. Sacred unions and vestal defiancy Elagabalus took Aquilia Severa, a vestal virgin sworn to 30 years of chastity as his wife, shattering a taboo believed to protect the very soul of the empire. The union was staged in Elagabalus' temple, where priests hailed the coupling as a cosmic marriage of sun god and earth. To marry a vestal was to rewrite Rome's religious charter, demonstrating that imperial desire outstripped even the holiest vows. Prostitution and public spectacle, but Elagabalus's revolution extended beyond formal ceremonies. He prostituted himself in the palace corridors, dressing as a female courtesan and soliciting guests charging admission for sexual services, and forcing Rome's elite into uneasy complicity. His favorite partner, Heracles, a charioteer, received honors rivaling those of an empress. Elagabalus would appear in public ceremonies, playing the submissive while Heracles enacted dominance, an explosive inversion of Roman sexual hierarchy. Every act was calculated to erode the old order by flattening distinctions between ruler and ruled. Male and female, sacred and profane, Elagabalus asserted that his will alone governed reality. Senators who once prided themselves on lineage and masculinity found themselves cheering a boy king, dressed as a harlot lest refusal marked them as enemies of the divine. Art, theater, and sexualized religion. Elagabalus transformed religious festivals into erotic theater. Barbarian ritual reenactments cast captive dancers in roles of mythic seduction. Phallic chariots rolled through Rome's streets, each drawn by dancers in semi-nude procession, chanting hymns to the Syrian sun. Temple ceilings, adorned with frescoes of united lovers, male and female, god and mortal. These spectacles banished any pretense of Roman restraint. Religious devotion merged with sensual abandon, creating a new state religion where sexual surrender equaled spiritual and political loyalty. Senate's last straw and assassination be AD 122. The Senate and Praetorian Guard could no longer stomach Elagabalus's unrelenting provocations. His behaviors, once shields of power, had become weapons aimed indiscriminately at Rome's traditions. Under cover of night, conspirators assassinated him in the palace. His body dragged through the streets, his memory consigned to damnatio memoria. Yet his short reign echoed far beyond his death. Elagabalus had exposed the fragility of sexual norms, revealing that imperial power could weaponize gender and desire as easily as armies did swords. Nero's theatrical debauchery. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, who reigned from AD 54 to 68, stands as one of Rome's most infamous emperors, and not solely for the Great Fire that ravaged the city in AD 64. Nero transformed imperial sexuality into public theater, turning Rome's grand stages and palaces into arenas of spectacle, humiliation, and erotic display. Where Caligula and Tiberius had conducted their excesses in private or on remote islands, Nero brought them front and center, wielding his own body and those of his partners as instruments of political control and cultural outrage. From golden boy to cultural provocateur. When Nero ascended the throne at age 17, the populace greeted him as a breath of fresh air. Groomed in music and arts, he promised a reign of peace and cultural patronage. Yet beneath that veneer of artistic sensibility lay an emperor determined to blaze his own trail, using sexuality as both a weapon and a stage prop. By early in his reign, Nero had already begun to blur lines between emperor, actor, and lover. He performed publicly as a lyre player and singer, acts deemed beneath the dignity of a Roman noble, but which he insisted on sharing with the crowds. From there, He extended his sense of performance to his sexual life, opening the imperial bedchamber's curtains to all who would watch. Sporus, the empress, who wasn't one of Nero's most notorious spectacles, involved Sporus, a young freedman of extraordinary beauty whom the emperor had castrated and then married in a mock imperial ceremony. Nero clothed Sporus in the trappings of an empress, silken togas dyed Tyrian purple, elaborate hairstyles, and jewelry, and paraded him through court functions. Contemporary historian Suetonius reports that Nero referred to Sporus by feminine titles, kissed him in public, and demanded that senators address him as Augusta. This act of taking Sporus as a wife was more than personal whim. It was a public assertion that the emperor could redefine gender, marriage, and social rank at will by elevating a castrated slave to empress status. Nero demonstrated the absolute imperial prerogative. He alone could decide who merited divine honor and who remained mere property. Senators, forced to honor Sporus, found their own status made hollow by the emperor's reckless reordering of Rome's most sacred institutions. Pythagoras, submission cast in marble, and Nero's next great erotic tableau featured Pythagoras, another favored young man. In this scenario, Nero cast himself firmly in the passive role, a position of imposed surrender, in stark defiance of Roman ideals of masculine dominance. At lavish banquets in the Domus Transitoria and later the Domus Aurea, Nero staged mock wedding ceremonies in which he, dressed as a bride, would be penetrated by an actor playing Pythagoras. Mimes and dancers enacted the scene before a hushed audience of senators and foreign dignitaries, each compelled to applaud. In one notorious instance, the banquet hall's floor was flooded to chest height so that the participants drunken. Guests included waded through water, dressed in wedding finery, to witness the emperor's erotic submission. These ceremonies served two functions: first, to entertain and shock; second, to convey a political message, by forcing Rome's elite to witness the emperor in a position they equated with slavery. Nero erased any lingering sense of their independence. In a single performance, he both humiliated the aristocracy and redefined the nature of imperial power as one that rested not on lineage or military command alone, but on the emperor's unassailable right to reshape identity and desire. Theatrical spectacles and public shaman, Nero further extended his sexual pageantry to Rome's theaters. He commissioned new plays and pantomimes in which he often performed scenes of erotic mythology, such as the rape of Proserpina or the seduction of Apollo by Hyacinthus with excessive realism. Audiences were treated to simulated consummations, and on occasion, actual sexual acts performed by the emperor or his lovers were woven into the dramatic narrative. One such production, staged in the Theatrum Marcelli, featured a chorus of scantily clad youths and girls portraying cupids whose task was to sprinkle scented oils over the audience, while Nero and his courtiers enacted the orgiastic finale. Attendance was mandatory for high-ranking officials. Refusal branded one a traitor to the emperor's cultural revolution. Beyond the theater, Nero hosted public Ludi games, where he would appear in chariot and foot races wearing women's garb, sometimes pairing with his lovers in staged erotic contests. The emperor's aim was clear: to collapse distinctions between sacred ritual, artistic performance, and private vice, ensuring that all of Rome was his stage and that every spectator was a complicit witness. Imperial policy by public humiliation. Nero's sexual spectacles had profound political utility. By publicly objectifying his partners, both slaves and high-born captives, he demonstrated that no status could shield one from imperial will. Those who saw their mothers, daughters, or wives forced into roles in the emperor's theater would think twice before challenging his policies. Moreover, the mixing of sacred mythology and erotic display undermined Rome's traditional religious and moral frameworks. The Vestal Virgins, once symbols of chastity and civic virtue, found themselves overshadowed by Nero's impious pageantry. Temples grew silent as Rome's gods watched their rituals diluted by forced performances that fused pagan worship with pornographic spectacle. Nero's downfall and erotic infamy. By the late 60s AD, Nero's reign of debauchery had alienated the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the common people alike. His Great Fire of 64 AD, whether started by accident or design, left Nero suspected of following up the destruction by lighting torches in the garden of his golden house for a grand performance. Rumors spread that he sang of Troy's fall as Rome burned, when revolts broke out in Gaul and Hispania, and the Praetorians deserted him. Nero fled Rome in shame. Facing execution, he reportedly pressed a dagger to his own throat, uttering the final words, "Qualis artifex pareo, what an artist dies in me." Yet it was his sexual excesses, immortalized by Tacitus and Suetonius, that cemented his legacy as the exemplar of imperial decadence. Nero had shown that in Rome, sex and spectacle were the twin engines of governance by turning his body into a public stage. He had asserted a power more potent and terrifying than any army or law. Messalina's midnight forays and the politics of promiscuous Julia Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius, stands among Rome's most notorious figures, not for wielding armies or passing edicts, but for using her sexual appetite as a tool of political intrigue. While male emperors flaunted dominance through monstrous spectacles, Messalina mastered the subtler arts of seduction, espionage, and blackmail, demonstrating that no throne was safe from the power of the boudoir. From matron to masked courtesan behind the imperial villa's marble facade, Messalina cultivated a double identity. By day, she presided over court ceremonies, bore imperial offspring, and presented herself as the ideal Augusta, modest, dutiful, and devoted to the state religion. But by night, she donned a blonde wig, a simple robe, and took the name Lays, billing herself as a common courtesan in Rome's most infamous brothel, the Lupanar in the Suburra district. This transformation was never a mere lark. Messalina's goal was to collect secrets, senators, equestrians, and foreign ambassadors, each convinced they were indulging in anonymous pleasure-confided ambitions, rivalries, and scandals. Messalina took note of every whispered promise and threat, storing them for her waking hours. The great brothel competition, known of Messalina's most sensational exploits, was an Olympic contest of carnality, pitting herself against Rome's premier courtesan, Sylla. In a single night, Messalina and Sylla competed to see who could serve the most clients in the imperial brothel. Messalina's strategy: she leveraged her imperial resources, private quarters, a retinue of eunuchs as bodyguards, and a network of servants to sustain an unbroken series of liaisons that numbered over 25 by dawn. Sylla's challenge: despite her professional skill, Sylla could only manage 23 men. Before exhaustion claimed her, the results were chronicled by historians such as Pliny the Elder and Suetonius, not as mere salacious gossip, but as evidence of Messalina's unrivaled sexual prowess and her bold facades. By masquerading as a prostitute, she demonstrated that even the highest matron could infiltrate and dominate Rome's underworld. Political machinations through pleasure. Messalina's nocturnal adventures were not for titillation alone. Each encounter served as an intelligence-gathering mission, blackmail material. Stories of senators seeking Lays became means to compel votes or silence opposition. Marital espionage: foreign dignitaries, believing her to be a mere courtesan, boasted of their nation's military and diplomatic secrets. Courtly rivalries: high-ranking women, jealous of her rumored exploits, inadvertently revealed palace intrigues in attempts to discredit her. Messalina's unsolicited information allowed Claudius to anticipate conspiracies, suppress sedition, and reward or punish courtiers at will. In effect, her bedchamber became an extension of the imperial cabinet. The unraveling, Salius and the forbidden marriage, and Messalian's ascent of sexual power hit its climax, and its downfall in AD 48, when she fell for Gaius Salius, a respected young senator known for his eloquence and physique. Under the influence of her courtesan persona, Messalina secretly wed Salius in a full-scale ceremony, complete with dowry negotiations and religious rites, while still married to Claudius. This brazen bigamy tantamount to treason occurred in the gardens of Lucullus, where Messalina's midnight festival degenerated into a mock imperial court, complete with private tribune, clerks, and attendants. Rumor has it that many believe Claudius to be dead, with Messalina and Silius poised to seize the throne themselves, senatorial retribution, and Messalina's end when the plot unraveled leaked. By a frightened confidant, Claudius reacted not with sorrow, but swift retribution. The Praetorian prefect, Narcissus, received secret orders to arrest Silius on charges of sedition, convinced Claudius that Messalina's betrayal threatened not just his honor, but the very stability of Rome, execute both conspirators without public trial. Citing emergency powers, Messalina fled, pleading for mercy, only to be cornered in the gardens. According to Suetonius, she bewailed, "Is this the reward for unraveled service?" before accepting her executioner's blade. Her body, unlike previous imperial women, was unceremoniously cast into an anonymous two-man ignominious end for Rome's most daring sexual strategist. Legacy. The power and peril of sexual intrigue. Messaline's life illustrates the dual edge of sexual dominance as statecraft, unrivaled intelligence. Her brothel espionage kept the imperial couple several steps ahead of conspirators. Ultimate hubris. By overplaying her hand, believing herself invincible, she provoked a backlash that cost her life. Her story became a cautionary tale in Roman and later literature. Sexual brilliance could build empires of influence, but unchecked, it could precipitate their collapse. In this, Messalina's legacy echoes the broader truth of Roman imperial sexuality. Sex was a means of control, but when wielded without restraint, it turned on its wielder with lethal force. Systemic sexual violence empire by rape and slavery. While the individual excesses of emperors like Caligula, Tiberius, and Messalina illustrate the personalization of imperial power through sex, the Roman state itself institutionalized sexual violence as an integral tool of conquest, control, and religious ritual. From the battlefield to the baths, from slavery markets to temple precincts, Rome wielded the body, particularly the bodies of subjugated peoples, as both weapon and symbol of its dominion, conquest, and the rape of nations. From the Republic's early wars through the empire's greatest expansions, rape was a declared policy of terror. Military edictum and generals issued orders permitting and often encouraging the raping of conquered women. These acts were theatrical. As legions marched forth, the destruction of local families signaled submission more effectively than any siege or treaty. Public spectacular triumphal parades in Rome regularly featured captive women and children displayed in chains, their violation assumed though unrecorded. Such displays reinforced the message that Rome's power reached into the most private domains of enemy societies. Psychological warfare by violating the sanctity of domestic life. Romans shattered morale. A community that could not protect women could neither defend its lands nor mount coherent resistance. Tacitus, recounting the Batavian revolt, notes that Germanic communities were so shamed by the rapes perpetrated by Roman soldiers that they capitulated rather than face further dishonor. Sexual slavery and the castration industry being the temporary horrors of conquest. Rome maintained a permanent infrastructure of sexual slavery. Human menagerie simpers, and wealthy aristocrats maintained large households of enslaved women, concubines, and prostitutes, who served not only domestic needs, but also the private lusts of their owners. Male slaves, deemed less valuable if intact, were routinely castrated, producing a subclass of eunuchs prized for their ability to guard harems without risk of offspring or insurrection. Castration. Factorious archaeologic and textual evidence points to workshops near ports, especially in Asia Minor, where young boys from conquered territories were castrated under brutal conditions. Mortality rates approached 50%. Survivors entered Rome's sexual economy, fetching high prices in slave markets and serving as court officials, temple attendants, or household retainers. Legal sanction. Roman law explicitly denied enslaved people any protection against sexual exploitation. A slave's body was the absolute property of its master, whose whims determined life, death, and violation. The castration industry was so extensive that it formed a significant segment of the empire's trade networks, with ships carrying human cargo alongside grain, wine, and other goods. Temple prostitution and cultic ritual sexual violence extended into the sacred sphere. Through cultic prostitution, sacred courtesans temples of deities like Venus Genetrix and Sybil employed priestesses whose sexual services, ostensibly for ritual purification, were compulsory for certain worshippers, though cloaked in religious necessity. These practices served as a revenue stream for temple coffers and a mechanism for social leveling. Both slave and free might be required to participate or pay for services. Priapia and phallic worship, public shrines to Priapus, the fertility god, featured giant phallic symbols and ritualized sexual performance. Emperors, most notably Elagabalus, staged public orgies in these precincts, normalizing extreme erotic display as a form of divine homage, controlled through pietabi, framing prostitution as pious duty. The state leveraged religious authority to authorize systemic sexual exploitation, ensuring that dissent against such practices equated to impiety and civic betrayal. Brothels as agents of imperial policy rooms. Famed red light districts were more than venues of pleasure. They were instruments of social control, regulation, and taxation. Brothels, both public and private, were licensed and taxed by the state, generating revenue while closely monitored by magistrates. Prostitutes underwent regular inspections. Brothel owners reported on patrons' identities, ensuring blackmail material for political purposes. Intelligence networks, courtesans, and pimps functioned as informants, passing information on clients' intrigues, finances, and factions to imperial handlers. Senate debates feature references to informal intelligence, gleaned from brothel encounters, illustrating how sex and espionage merged seamlessly under imperial auspices. Political sponsorship. Emperors and senators often owned shares in brothels, directing profits toward political campaigns. Sexual commerce thus fueled electoral and social ambitions, binding elites ever closer to imperial favor. Enforcement and impunity. Sexual violence was underwritten by complete impunity. For perpetrators, military discipline. Soldiers accused of rape faced little more than formal reprimand. Conviction depended on the social status of the victim and the commander's favor. Senatorial exemption be law. Senators and equestrians enjoyed immunity from prosecution for sexual crimes against slaves and provincials. Judicial corruption. Governors in distant provinces colluded with local elites to suppress complaints, ensuring that sexual exploitation flourished unchecked. This legal architecture made sexual violence as routine as taxation and accepted cost of empire. The legacy of imperial sexual domination throne that emerged from centuries of such policies bore deep scars. Cultural trauma. Conquered provinces remembered Roman rape and enslavement in their collective memory, fueling later rebellions and contributing to the empire's tenuous hold on distant lands. Social stratification. Normalization of sexual exploitation codified hierarchies. Free men's honor depended on dominating others, while women and slaves were perpetual objects of control. Religious reformation. Rise of Christianity, with its emphasis on chastity and spiritual equality, can be read in part as reactionary, a countercultural rejection of the empire's ruthless sexual ethos. In sum, Rome's imperial sexuality was no mere indulgence, it was government policy, woven into its conquest strategies, its markets, and its temples. By transforming bodies into arenas of power play and spectacle, the empire institutionalized fear, submission, and control, ensuring that its dominion was felt not only in law and coin, but in the most intimate folds of human flesh. Sexual magic, amulets, and healing rites. While Rome's sexual violence and public spectacles displayed imperial dominion, they also birthed a parallel tradition of erotic magic and healing rituals, a domain where sex and spirituality intertwined to cure, protect, and manipulate bodies in service of power. In this chapter, we delve into how Romans harnessed sexual symbolism, amulets, and sacred rites, often under imperial patronage, to shape health, fate, and even political allegiance. The cult of Priapus and phallic worship at the heart of sexual Magic stood Priapus, the rustic fertility god famed for his enormous phallus. Across the empire, small shrines to Priapus, often roadside herms bearing oversized marble phalli, offered travelers both good luck and apotropaic protection against theft, evil spirits, and ill fortune. Public herms and porticos and courtyards. These phallic statues were rubbed or kissed by passers-by seeking potency in love, success in business, and health in their families. Priestly fraternity eschatology of Priapic priests, sometimes including freedmen and minor nobles, oversaw annual festivals, the Priapia, featuring ritual dances around phallic effigies, litanies praising Priapus's seed of abundance, and erotic performances that blurred the line between worship and orgy. Imperial patronage bursts such as Caligula and Nero publicly sponsored Priapic cults, commissioning gilt bronze phalli for the Palatine and integrating Priapus into state religious calendars. By aligning themselves with Priapus, they claim mastery over the sexual forces that govern nature and human fate. Magical amulets, fetishes of fertility and protection remnants adorn themselves and their homes with small objects believed to contain virtues generativa, the power of creation. Fascinum phallic talisman, often cast in bronze or carved from bone. These miniature phalli were worn as pendants or hung from children's cradles to ward off the evil eye, a malevolent gaze thought capable of sapping sexual potency and causing misfortune. Bulla, young freeborn boys wore locke-like bulli, containing protective charms, including tiny phalli, labyrinthine amulets, and inscriptions invoking Mercury and Venus to safeguard their health and virility until they reached adulthood. Lunula, crescent moon pendants given to girls at birth, featured phallic motifs on their reverse side, symbolizing the harmony of masculine and feminine, intended to ensure fertility and ward off infertility demons. These objects circulated widely, crossing class lines from patrician matrone to plebeian artisans, testifying to the pan-urban desire for magical sexual safeguard. Erotic incantations in medical papyri and medical manuals, notably the papyri of sorcery circulating in Alexandria and later in Rome, catalog recipes marrying herbs with explicit spells. Grind a handful of lettuce seeds and mix with honey. Speak the name of Priapus thrice whilst anointing your loins, so that no nocturnal emission shall stain your honor. Lettuce lactuca sativa, believed to induce both arousal and nocturnal release. Its seeds were used in incense and potions to regulate sexual appetite. Pomegranate rind, employed in cold infusions to quell excessive passion, often accompanied by recitations to Juno, goddess of marriage, to maintain conjugal fidelity. Mandrake root, a potent narcotic reserved for deep love potions. Its seductive fumes inhaled in closed chambers, lined with erotic murals to induce visionary states of erotic devotion. These recipes display a spectrum from prophylactic to aphrodisiac to abortifacient, revealing that Roman sexuality was not only a public spectacle, but also a private science, governed by experimentation and magical protocol. Sacred prostitution and healing sanctuaries. Many deities combined sexuality with health. Temples to Venus, Aesculapius, and Diana often featured sacred courtesans whose services balanced between ritual offering and therapeutic act. Temple of Venus Genetrix, Forum of Caesar, housed Venalia, priestesses who offered ritual embraces to penitent worshippers seeking relief from impotence or marital strain. Their massages with scented oils were believed to restore both vitality and divine favor. Sancta Sanctorum of Aesculapius, Tiber Island, patients slept in incubation dormitories, where erotic dreams induced by the goddess Hygeia through subtle aphrodisiac vapors revealed personal healing regimens. Many recorded their erotic visions on tablets, later interpreted by temple physicians as medical prescriptions. Cult of Bacchus in Bacchanalia, initially small rites, but later outlawed for excess participants engaged in sacred madness, where sexual abandon was believed to purge the soul of disease and social guilt. The state's crackdown in 186 BCE underscored the volatile boundary between healing ecstasy and political subversion. These institutions demonstrate that erotic function and medical care were not separate branches of Roman culture, but interwoven. paths to physical and spiritual well-being. The emperor, as high priest of sexual healing, emperors often appropriated these traditions to bolster their sacral image. Sacred marriages, a Julio Claudian, such as Claudius, might officiate nuptials within goddess temples, casting his own fertility as a divine blessing upon the realm. Distribution of amulets on imperial birthdays and triumphs, the emperor threw fascina to the crowd, phallus-shaped tokens said to confer health and libido. Healing edicts during plagues. Nero famously and perhaps apocryphally declared that marriage and childbearing were sacred duties, exempting newlyweds from certain taxes and distributing bulla to newborns, thus entwining state policy with sexual sanctification. Through these acts, emperors positioned themselves as guardians of Romanus, the arbiters of both civic order and the most intimate human functions. Conclusion: the alchemy of flesh and faith in ancient Rome. Sexual magic was neither fringe nor taboo, but a central thread in the empire's tapestry of power. From the whispered incantations of medical sorcery to the monumental phallic shrines of Priapus, Romans believed that touching the divine often meant touching the body their own, or another's, in ceremonial acts that healed, enslaved, and consecrated by embedding eroticism within religion and medicine. Rome ensured that every citizen, patrician, or plebeian participated in a continuum, where sexual prowess could mean health, political favor, or salvation, just as its absence could spell disease, dishonor, or death. This sacred science of sex underscores a singular truth of the empire. True dominion over men and gods alike required mastery of the oldest, most powerful of human forces, from Caligula's incestuous brothels to Tiberius's island torture chambers, from Elagabalus's gender-bending pageantry to Nero's public erotic theater, and from Messalina's shadow espionage to the empire's systemic rape and sexual slavery. Rome's rulers turned sex into sovereignty. Their beds were battlefields, their lovers either pawns or pillars of power, and their spectacles a constant reminder that no command was more absolute than that over another person's body. Yet this legacy is not merely a lurid chapter in antiquarian lore. It offers enduring lessons. Intimacy as influence. Political actors continue to weaponize personal relationships using sexual access, blackmail, or public scandal to gain advantage. Ancient Rome simply codified what remains a common stratagem. Performance of authority, theatricality, costuming, stage ceremonies. Public rituals remain central to leadership. Modern political theater echoes Nero's ludi as much as Caligula's palace spectacles. Institutionalized violence, when laws place some bodies beyond protection. Exploitation becomes systemic. The echoes of Roman sexual slavery and conquest remind us to guard legal and human rights for all, lest atrocity become policy. Sacred versus secular power. Rome's fusion of sex, religion, and statecraft anticipated later regimes that blurred ritual and governance. Recognizing and challenging those conflations remains vital for safeguarding personal freedoms. In the end, Rome's emperors wielded the oldest human impulse, sex, not for love or procreation, but as the sharpest edge of control. Their reigns illustrate how absolute power can corrupt even the most intimate realms of life. As we reflect on their legacy, we confront a timeless truth. Wherever authority claims dominion over the body, liberty and dignity hang in the balance.